Sybylle's mentioned that there is, both she and I are very keen in an afterlife, in revenants, in ghosts, in resurrections, and a whole series of spiritual incarnations. We've been talking for a long period of time that actually part of this process was to kickstart the kind of the networking and the research to go towards a book very similar to the work that Sibylle had led with Morton Paley on the reception of Blake in Europe. We think, and this conference may be just part of that, but we think that mapping out of Blake's reception around the world, and indeed, we've had contributions from those, Steve Clark and Masashi Suzuki, who were instrumental in the kind of the reception of Blake in the Orient, etc. We kind of have ambitions of going through that process of mapping through the world, although there's also then, it's become quite clear to me over the past couple of days that there's probably material for another book, a very different approach to issues around reception and pop culture, or indeed, the kind of the depth of culture as well. So we're going to meet next week, and you're going to hear a lot from us over the coming weeks and months, because we want to work through these. Another element that I just want to draw attention in terms of practicalities, that's that site globalblake.zoomorphosis.com is not going to disappear. Actually, a very, very straightforward element there is the next stage, the next immediate stage over the next few weeks, is that it becomes a repository for the conference proceedings in the form of videos, etc. This is a very nice resource. People have constantly been asking, when can we watch the videos, etc. I've been starting to upload them. It's going to take a bit of time, folks, but it will happen actually probably by early February that will go on there. But we're kind of talking about the fact that we're looking as this is becoming a centre for some kind of academic events as well. I mean, I'll give you one thing that's just occurred. It's only occurred to me over the past 3 days. So my apologies, Sibylle. We haven't had our debriefing yet. So I am, as you know, I do on a regular basis, hot-footing this. There are so many connections, for example, of Blake in Brazil, that I'm just going, this is amazing. I want to hear more. I want an event that concentrates on Blake in Brazil, for example, the Portuguese Blake. As a number of people know, that I've been very, very interested in Blake and music for a long period of time, and there's just so much rich stuff out there. It strikes me that again. So Global Blake might actually be, we're hoping, can become a little bit of a hub for generating. We probably won't rush to do a conference of this nature, but little of talks, of symposia, of smaller, more concentrated or focused events, and keep those going on a relatively regular basis. Ideally, as well, when the world returns to something resembling sanity, we can also then do stuff physically in company with each other as well. But actually, as a way of meeting up on a semi-regular basis throughout the year to talk about aspects of Blakeiana, we think that Global Blake we kind of want to keep it going. So that's partly the afterlife that will then allow for regular dipping in, etc. So some practical elements, and as Sibylle said, we are looking for opportunities. In a sense, this is about networking as well. I mean, so many of us here have been in similar conferences, met each other, we work with each other, we publish papers with each other, and we're kind of, both Sibylle and I, two Blake heads living in the same city. What are the chances of, a small northern city as well? And we've always been very keen on building this up.
Just to second this, and this is the technology as well as the face-to-face, just to share the interesting discoveries and materials that there are. And this also goes for the artwork that we've seen, the books, illustrations, musics, and have live events, which we might stream. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but as Jason says, more specific, focused clusters where we can see channels of transmission and how that then reflects on reception studies generally, as well as the directions and Blake studies, is something that I'm very, very curious about. I mean, this is going almost into the round table now. This is what this conference has been about. Where are we at, and what's changed through reception, coming of age, and Blake studies, perhaps, if I may be pushing that point. Okay. Yeah, it's a beginning. It's a beginning. That's what it's always been.
Shall we invite our
Yes.
keynotes to make so? If you just bear, I'm just typing one message into the chat, and then Stephen, if you wouldn't mind, I'll share your slides and then move to you. So give me literally 1 second.
Sure. While Jason's doing that, let me just again thank Jason and Sibylle. Sibylle, you've been tremendously generous and helpful and welcoming, and so I thank you enormously. And great to meet so many of you whose work I know, and to see, not in the flesh, but in the ether. It's great. So thank you. And I just wanted to, I can also say while Jason's loading the images that because of the time difference, I wasn't able to hear all the talks. So rather than offer a synthesis of the conference papers, I wanted to say just a few few things about the underlying idea of a global Blake, and to share what I learned about the figure in the last few days. So as soon as the images. Okay. Actually, well, that's okay. We'll get to that in a moment. About the idea of a global Blake. First of all, the speakers demonstrated, to my satisfaction at least, that Blake is indeed global. His work has been translated, I learned, and retranslated into Portuguese, Turkish, Polish, Slavic languages, Chinese and Japanese, not to mention French, German, and Spanish. It'd be interesting to know if he's been translated into indigenous or First Nation languages, given how many times people have invoked ideas of indigenous knowledge and Blake. Blake's words have been set to music by classical or art music composers, folk singers, rock and pop stars. His images are found on album covers, advertisements, and book jackets. Scientists quote lines from his poems to represent to lay people principles that are otherwise abstract or hard to grasp. I heard a couple of speakers address that. So far, so good. Conference job, well done, everybody. But I'm not so sure that the conference speakers, myself included, sufficiently address the question why Blake has become global. It's a difficult question, but one possible answer is that Blake actually set out to be a global or international artist. Maybe Mike Goode would call that art history in the subjunctive. Before evaluating the claim, consider just how rare such an ambition and such a status actually is. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, neither Hogarth, Reynolds, nor Turner set out to become anything like global figures. They were national in their orientation, or at most European in their perspective. Hogarth was committed to a demotic English and bourgeois art, and Reynolds and Turner to a British and foreign art that could stand up to any works produced by the old masters. In the 20th century, an age of mass communication and cultural exchange, or of emerging globalization, when it became more possible to be a global artist, there were, I would say, just three global artists: Charlie Chaplin, Pablo Picasso, and Diego Rivera. The first, whom I represent here by the still from City Lights, my favorite of Chaplin's movies, was between about 1915 and 1930 the most famous person in the world, and almost universally beloved. Like Blake, he was a composite artist, one's director, writer, actor, and composer. The second figure, next slide. Picasso reinvented painting with Cubism around 1907 to 9, and mastered just about every other artistic medium, including sculpture, printmaking, and ceramics. His Guernica has been a model and a foil for every activist artist almost everywhere on the planet, from the time it was first exhibited in 1937 until now. Next slide. Diego Rivera created a combined high and popular art, drawing at once from the fresco painters of the Renaissance, the popular painters of retablos, and the illustrators like Posada of the Penny Press. Man at the Crossroads, shown here, was painted for Rockefeller Center, but was judged too internationalist, that is communist, by its patrons, and so was whitewashed. He recreated it for the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, which is shown here. Rivera's art was seen and loved by millions and was a model for generations of revolutionary artists who followed. Frida Kahlo did not perhaps have such ambition, but has recently achieved a near global status also. Now, William Blake was obviously concerned most of all about the patronage and response of British audiences. All that stuff about Albion, Jerusalem, Locke, and Stonehenge proves his Britishness. but his religious dissent, ecumenism, rejection of war and jingoism, disdain for the high culture of Enlightenment rationalism, anti-racism, and endorsement of dissident ideas of communalism, if not outright communism, marks him as a global, if not international figure, and considers some of his most famous images. Next, please. Ancient of Days. Next. The Newton. Newton was there. That's okay. And of course, his plates for Urizen and Milton. Next slide. These are planetary, not just global images, and appear to address our current political and environmental crisis. Of course, global ambition isn't by any means a guarantee of global achievement. Moreover, globalized Blake may also mean instrumentalized, commodified, packaged, or kitsch Blake. Indeed, an artist who focused so intensely on imagination and individual freedom arising from organic community is grist for an industry mill that constantly seeks to slate unfulfilled desire with commercial products of one kind or another. So given all this, it's not surprising that Blake would be turned to as resource, a set of images, ideas, songs, and myths that can be repurposed as need arises. These are obviously just a few general suggestions about Blake's globality. We'll need a second conference or that follow-up book or project that Jason and Sibylle talk about in order to more fully explore the specifics of that global vision. Thanks so much, and thanks for listening to my previous keynote and for my little few summary remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing the slides for a moment. Is this the point where I revealed that actually the mundane shell and the four zoas is actually what I've got tattooed on my back? But that's probably for another conference and another time. But hey ho. Yeah, just to end on a weird note, I've got a couple more coming in a while. So I'll pass with that remark on to Linda, ask you to make some comments on the Global Blake Conference or just Blake generally.
I don't know what's harder to follow, the tattoo revelation or that slide presentation. But either way, I think it can only be disappointing. I'm afraid I have no slides. I was going with spontaneity as the mode of response. But I did have a few thoughts that you know have come to me really while I've been taking in an enormous amount of new information through this conference. And on the one hand, I think the extraordinary organisation and technical competence, the feat. I mean, I'm a bit of a Luddite really, and I am only in awe of how you've managed to pull this off. And I think, in some sense, it's the most sort of the strongest corrective to Blake's critique of organisation has been the feat that you've pulled off over the last few days, which has been anything but Eurozenic. And certainly, I think we are on our way to discovering a system which is only liberating. So that might be the greatest triumph. But there are some things that have that I was thinking really about what's happening among this group of people. And one of the things that really struck me, and I think it's been clear from the comments in the chat, is the astonishing scope of material. I think that's been revealed. There's a lot of detailed, granular work that's been happening, a lot of things which have been fresh to me, and I think fresh to lots of people here. There are people here who are much more knowledgeable than I am, but I think everyone will have found out something new, and that is quite, it's quite an achievement really, to still be turning out new material in that way. So I think that's been one of the real triumphs of it. The other thing that it's made me think about a little bit is what we do when we do reception work, because on the one hand, I think that granular work is extremely important. We can't do anything without it. We need to know how things travel. We need to know what response is in a kind of material, traceable way. But there are also different stories that we start to tell. And that's, I think, been one of the things that's always interested me and that continues to interest me. And that out of this conference, which has been overwhelming, I think, in its sheer kind of range of material, there start to be certain kinds of stories that we can start to tell about not only what Blake has meant to people, but the ways in which these juxtapositions, these revisions, these creative responses start to become part of our reading practice. That it actually becomes reception done well and done in the way it's been done here becomes the bread and butter of our discipline, really, because we are reading how people read and the use that we make of inspirational material. So I think that's been really the sort of great triumph of it from my point of view. So I can only congratulate everybody who took part. And hopefully we're going to have some more focused questions and answers rather than me kind of waffling on sentiments.
Thank you. Forgive me, Sibylle, I'm just jumping in to keep going because I'll now ask Mike to say a few words as well, please.
Thank you, Linda.
Sure, and I absolutely want to reiterate what everyone else has said about the extraordinary organization of this event, and it was incredibly informative, and I learned a lot, but that obviously would not have been possible without just the array of technology and technical prowess behind it, and the thoughtfulness of setting up the panels and everything else, and so that it's been really a pleasure. And I too don't have any slides to share, and I have actually attended every single panel, and so I'm a little bit fuzzy at this point because that's meant getting up at 4:30 in the morning each morning, which I am not a morning person. So I apologize if I'm a little bit scattered here, but I was thinking about what Stephen was saying about how Blake has gone global, and I always come back to Weichi Dimmock's formulation of why any artist endures is not that they're producing sort of like impenetrable diamonds that can't be chipped away at, but more things that are able to be kind of open and break out in a riot of tongues. Like endurance is actually a function of fragmentation at some level, and openness. And I do think that there is a particular different kinds of openness to the Blakean text that various people have talked about in some of their presentations, of formal openness and interpretive openness and political openness at times, that medial openness that kind of inspires a wide range of responses. And I think a term I haven't heard much at this conference, but that certainly is around in media studies, is talking about kind of convergence culture and the way in which different kinds of media will converge on the same object in a sense, like produce more and more kind of iterations of that thing. And I think we certainly need to think about that as an object of study within the study of Blakean reception itself, like thinking of because there's in this vast array of incredibly informative panels, there's still a bit of a gravitation to the kind of artist to artist connection or text to text connection, and trying to which is like wonderful in itself, but I'm trying to think about what other kinds of versions of Blakean reception do we see if we make actually something like media convergences the object, as opposed to that artist to artist or text to text dyad. And then a second thing is, I have to confess to you, like, I actually think of myself as more of a Walter Scott and Jane Austen scholar than a Blake scholar. And I'm used to answering this question that we're talking about right now with Blake in relation to Jane Austen, like, all the time. And one of the things, though, that I think is where I think an overlap is worth thinking about is that, a longstanding argument in Jane Austen's popularity is that Austen makes you feel like an insider into her novels, which is to say, like, as a the narrator makes you feel in on the jokes. You feel rounder than some of the other characters that you're laughing at or whatever. And I think it's worth thinking about as we've looked at some of the kinds of different reception histories that have come out here, especially the attention to the kind of Ginsberg, Duncan 60s countercultural like through line, the attention to the Crowleyan, Yeatsian kind of spiritualist theosophical through line that there is an element of Blake that makes you approach it as if the text is courting kind of insiders. I mean the whole mode of prophecy, the whole mode of having a kind of mythology that you can never entirely wrap your head around because certain figures show up once. Like the whole that there's something about that does kind of encourage that kind of relationship to Blake. And I think that's worth thinking about, and certainly I think some of you know from my own work, I'm interested almost in the opposite. Like I'm interested in the times in which people are invoking Blake in ways in which are not from that kind of insider status, and what we can learn from that. And then maybe just one last thing I would throw in is that I think another some obvious running through line through a lot of the conference was the radicalism, political radicalism, artistic or aesthetic radicalism of a lot of the engagements with Blake coming out of different various different national manifestations of Blake's presence and various people who are experimenting with the forms of printmaking and graphic novel writing and whatever, and that we can. There's obviously like the grounding of Blake and Blake presenting himself as a radical that's gonna seed that. I'm interested there, and I think that academia is a place in which we most of us are on the left, and so there's a kind of gravitation to that sort of history. I am curious. I would be curious, like what kinds of Blakean reception history might be out there that are in the service of the not so radical. And I think Jason was alluding to Jason nodding. I think Jason was alluding to that a little bit with the sort of ways in which Jerusalem can be pulled out in as a nationalist anthem, and I've seen in my vast searching of Blakean proverbs, like I've come across them a number of times in contexts where they're designed to help seal business deals, like they're in business manuals at times, in absurd ways. But I came across a Blake proverb on the header recently of a hedge fund that was using the phrase like dip him in the river who loves water to try to convince people to stay in the cryptocurrency market. And I think all those things are actually worth studying also in terms of trying to think about not just media convergences around Blake, but forms of reception that sometimes we don't necessarily pay attention to because of our own politics. And that's more just of a kind of a provocation than a critique. But this has truly been a wonderful event, and I should shut up now because I can feel the fuzziness in my head. So
thank you very much, Mike.
So Luisa.
Again, I want to join everybody to celebrate the work that Jason and Sibylle have put into this and the extraordinary expansions of our doors of perception over those couple of days, especially with those absolutely spectacular performances, and also just the sheer interest of and intricacy of local traditions within the global Blake, I think has been very valuable. So I was thinking about methods that we've encountered from the translation panel, which raised the problem of the textual corpus, the concord, and thinking about how that kind of approach, which is obviously absolutely crucial if you're doing, well, if you are making translations, and then if you're doing translation analysis. I remember my aesthetics professor who convinced us to read German because because Kant is so much easier in German without all the fuzziness of the multiple synonyms that the silly Italian translators introduced for key concepts that Kant had made so easily and so clearly in German. And a number of us did go off. And, easy is not the word, but certainly the problem of translation that we heard about in relation to the Polish project is something that really spoke to me through that experience of the need to have constellations, clear constellations, so that the act of translation is, so that there's a clear map of what the act of translation is doing. Obviously, it could be quite stifling because translation is also extraordinary creative process, but it's certainly a tension that it is important to bear in mind and to keep track of. And so then I was thinking, okay, so the textual corpus and technologies, methods and technologies that obviously are changing and producing different corpora from the sort of structuralist, paradigmatic approaches that those of us who are trained on Saussure and Jacobson learned to think through, to the spectacular work that Mike Goode did with the n-grams, while also pointing out all the limitations of OCR and other exclusions that might make the visibility of the n-gram in some ways obfuscating as it is revealing, and producing a field that is in its own sake a production and not just an analysis. And then I was thinking about the process of intermediation, the history of words that connect to other conceptual frameworks and other languages. And it was fascinating to hear the comment about the Turkish word for prophecy, following Linda's question, that obviously brings into the reading of Blake a completely different world, which obviously shifts what Blake means in different contexts and in different times. And then I was really interested in the attention to rhythm that came through a number of papers, the papers on music, with attention to how to adapt, cut, and montage Blake's words in order to meet particular rhythms. Also, the translators' points about the intractability of metrical obstacles or challenges as translators try to find a language and a rhythm in their own language, but also questions to do with the synchronization, dialectic, or separation of the senses that come through different channels of mediation, which for me, working on unbound circulation of images is a question with great anxiety, because it raises real gaps in what we need and what we have in terms of bibliography of images, methods for tracking the migration and reproduction of images to make good of what Stephen was saying about tracking the migration of Blake on album covers in ways that are not just our own impressionistic or extensive knowledge. And Mark Lucia's point about the Ferragamo, please do share that. I really want to see it. But obviously advertising, so many absolutely fascinating uses for which we don't have a coherent record. And there's some creativity in that, but also some challenges. I mean, with Blake Illustrated Quarterly, I know that my method is to write to every curator in the world that is known to have original Blakes in their collections, which is, yes, quite a demanding task. but also, you know, it's a method. But what about reproductions? I mean, Martin Myrone in Visual Culture in the Journal of Visual Culture in Britain, he wrote a piece as he was producing his exhibition. He wrote a piece reflecting on the history of exhibitions and said that we obviously need to document the reception of Blake's visual corpus by means of reproductions and not just the loan of originals. And in this conference, we've had some fascinating examples of that. And that again raises questions. How do we go about that? So that's, yeah, I'd love to have answers on that. And there's so much more. One thing that has always interested me so much is the non-contemporaneity of translation. So trying to figure out, for me, that meant, you know, trying to figure out the 1970 to 1975 corpus of theoretical materials that were being read while reading Blake and how they interfaced. And in my life as an Italian operating in Britain, I've always been really surprised by how different, for instance, Adorno in English is from Adorno in Italian, and then you realize that they were translated in very different decades and in radically different political moments and produced different formations. And I think that that's really important when we think about reading communities and traditions, you know, the intellectual history aspect of what we do. But then I'm also really intrigued by another, sorry, Mike, sorry, this is a fan moment. There's a point that Mike makes about the fact that the concept of the interpretive community is problematic because it assumes shared text. But is that true? Again, that's something which I think we need to look at, but how? So many questions. I think I'll shut up though, because there could be so many more questions.
Thank you very much, Luisa.
Then I'm also really intrigued by another, sorry, Mike. That's absolutely perplexing for literature scholars looking at the visual, you know, the tradition of titling, for instance. You know, if you're looking for something, you look for a title, but in archives of visual culture, in museums, there's a liberty with retitling artworks that is really startling and worth significant work in itself, I think.
Yeah, I just want to briefly comment on this, and I've seen that Mike has his hand up. In terms of methods and methodologies and forms of reception, I think that's incredibly important in terms of consistency. And there is a point, I mean, this is my impression, where we are recording what's out there, and it's the fetish of the archive. There's nothing more exciting than having a box and then opening it and find, for me, what's actually inside it. And then, is there a title, is there any description, whatever object it is? And there's material that's not captured in the digital cataloging, and it's that what makes it histories of discoveries or stories of discoveries. And that can only be done by people who are familiar. Blake is a poet, he's an artist, he's an engraver, and it's that multiplicity that needs a lot of people to find what's out there. This is in addition to the so what interpretation. And in addition to the methodology question. Mike.
Yeah, this just kind of following up on that and following up on Luisa's comment. Like I think the thing that I've enjoyed the most about this conference is seeing so many visual objects that I didn't know existed, and the inability to even know how to go about, searching for some of those things that you don't know that exist without sort of visual tags to Blake somehow somewhere in a database or on the internet would be incredibly challenging. And I think that it would be in thinking about futures of Blakean reception and even futures of this conference, I mean, trying to figure out actually how to create an archive of some of the kinds of images and things that have been, you know, kind of collected together at events like this, and things that people can, or things that people can tag, you know, just on the internet somewhere, and have a kind of set of links to, or whatever, would be an amazing resource, because certainly. I'll confess, I tried to do something like a Blake spotting project one time with images, and my crude workaround was to try to figure out, you know, using Google's image search, where you can actually take the JPEG itself and put it in the search box and find all the instances on the internet of that one JPEG, you know, and it's just such an inferior tool for finding those kinds of, I mean, you're finding reusages of that one file, which is kind of interesting in itself, but it's just simply not even remotely close to the kinds of searchability functions that you can have with text. And you know, I know this is a problem perennially from talking to Morris with the Blake archive too, of trying to figure out how they tag and make visually searchable elements of that archive, you know, things that look like such and such, you know, there has to be kind of human coding behind that to determine what looks like what, you know, and that's obviously a frontier that we still need to kind of work with.
Thank you.
If I could just say one thing about that, Mike, this is where art historians have an edge in terms of the images, because they look at tons of them, and like you do, presumably with references in Jane Austen and whatever else, and they stick in your head. So if an art historian looks at an image by Blake, they go, "Oh, I've seen that before," and you rummage through your files in your head, and you find it. So this is where disciplinary rigor, you know, really matters, and where I fall down in terms of the Blake text, and somebody else may fall down in terms of the Blake images, and that's where collaboration helps. That's
you remind me of when I first got my job, being very excited and going to a panel on interdisciplinarity in which Linda Need was talking. And she said, the first thing she said, "Well, I'm an art historian. I see things better than others." And I thought, oh no. And, you know, all of my anxieties were just, but the thing is that it's chance encounters and chance memories. However, you know, however trained by disciplinary training, it's quite different. I mean, especially when you're exposed to these incredible things coming from Japan, from Brazil, you know, which only Sibylle and Jason can find ways of bringing to our attention, you just realize how much you're missing out on. And yeah, I mean, there's also something about the creativity of the chance encounter as opposed to the you know, the scientific database approach, whatever that might be for images. But yeah, I don't know. I'd love to have some tools.
I've got
Encounter
one more.
seems a very Blakean way to approach difference, really, doesn't it? You know, that he's very interested in encounter and the bounding line of encounter, that kind of energetic openness that one might have to things that are not the same as what one is, which seems to be one way, I suppose, of thinking rather in his vocabulary about the kind of methodology that you're talking about. And that something might come from that kind of creative.
Jason. Thank you, Linda.
It started off with the kind of the hunts for Blakeana, and I use that word quite specifically rather than, because one thing that's occurred across this conference at different points is that Mike Goode spotting, you know, so the number of us who took that Blake spotting. In my case, I made a goddamn career out of it. Thank you. I want for a moment just to cut across. I'm going to make a very trivial point, and I apologize in advance, but it's actually and as a preface for my academic chops, I would point out, you know, a book for a popular audience, but on divine images, which was really dealing with Blake's spirituality, his spiritual vision. And the book coming out this year on the reception of Blake in English nationalist culture. Believe me, Mike, there are reception cultures that we do not engage with on a regular basis. And it was quite depressing to write that book. But for a moment, I want to not exactly give a defense, but a re-evaluation of the kitsch of the commodity. I'm going to start off with, because I collect people, anybody who follows my Twitter account will know I collect Blake shit. I go onto eBay and elsewhere, and this one, which you probably can't see very well, is a Todd McFarlane. I'm just going to screen share a better image of it. Todd McFarlane's Urizen. This is Urizen from the Spawn series of cartoons. So this is a little 3-inch figurine, which of course I found because I just trawl incessantly for stuff on William Blake. I'll just leave that for a moment while I just talk. And Todd McFarlane, this is a commodity. This is absolutely that mining Blake for stuff you can sell. At the same time, Spawn, I don't know if anybody's ever read the Spawn comics, they're actually pretty good. They actually have a genuine artistry and bizarre narrative arc, which I think is valid in its own right. The term I used to use, I don't use so much anymore because Blake spotting became so useful, was zoomorphs, these mutations, these aberrations of pop culture. And I'd actually for me, one of the things I love about Blake is that I can go from the incredibly serious, the meaning of the most popular poem that Blake wrote in England, which is Jerusalem. Most people don't know it's written by Blake. They sing it or half sing it because they don't really know the words and feel really roused and have all these emotions. And they don't realise the history, both from Blake, but also Parry, who wrote it, who then gave that music to the suffragettes. He wanted it to be the women's voters' hymn. So I could deal with these very serious things, but also Blake, for me, I kind of like the gossipy Blake. I kind of like the chatty, the paraphernalia Blake. I mean, that's what I really enjoyed, Mike, the viral Blake. I quite like those fragments that flake away and fall off and get used in ways that I, as a serious Blake scholar, and I've completely undermined that, but I tend not to. When I started in Blake, it was all I had to understand profoundly, and actually I think most people, they don't, and I kind of appreciate when people encounter Blake. And I want to end, but also how the gossipy Blake gets caught up with academics. I was involved in a kind of a chat with Joe Viscomi, and we ended up talking about, because I did a talk for him last term, and we ended up talking about Mary Butts, who's cropped up in this conference, the granddaughter of Thomas Butts. She grew up literally surrounded by Blake paintings in a house in Devon. She literally had, sort of the biblical paintings on the wall. If there was anybody who had access to the authentic Blake, it was Mary Butts. But what Joe and I ended up talking about was the fact that she had an affair with Cecil Maitland and ran off with him to Kefaloon, the monastery in Sicily run by Aleister Crowley. And she became obsessed with Crowley for a while, and he was incredibly rude to her. Surprise, surprise. Called her, a redhead. I won't say the word actually, and a worm and the white worm and stuff like that. But she was actually obsessed with this kind of pseudo occult stuff, which she then brushed away when she came to her senses. And I actually think that for me, Aleister Crowley. It was partly inspired by Adriano's comment, he doesn't like Aleister Crowley. I wrote a piece in 2007 in which I was actually very dismissive of Crowley. I think Crowley's a superficial reader, but I'm actually genuinely interested in that superficial reading of Blake, because what happens through Crowley comes in through David Bowie, through Jimmy Page, all these other people suddenly have an interest in Blake because they think Blake is cool. And on one level that pisses, I literally devote my life to William Blake, and it pisses me off a bit. But the same token, I also found it astonishing. Well, I'll speak to somebody and they'll go, "Oh, I read The Lamb Was at School and it really touched me." And that's all they know about Blake. And yet at that moment, my mind and theirs, we just meet. For a second, we kind of, we do the mental handshake and then move on with our lives. And I always find that one of the most incredibly inspiring moments for me. That the moments of the fragments of Blake that I encounter with other people, never cease to amaze me and never cease to touch me. All that from a plastic figure.
Well, Ines, you have your hand up, and then Stephen.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I just couldn't let this meeting, this wonderful conference end without thanking you again and again, Sibylle and Jason, for offering me this opportunity. Maybe for you all, this is not your first conference about Blake, but for me, it's my first conference, a Blaking conference. I've attended a lot of conferences, but again, in my country, there are no Blaking scholars, unfortunately. So I was always reading books, all sorts of books about Blake, but was wondering, what if I attend the conference in which all the people speak about Blake, and this was a wonderful opportunity. All the details I heard, all the new things, all the ideas I had about Blake were asserted, or I mean, I had really a global idea about Blake, especially that in my PhD, it is sometimes people tell me that you are going far. People sometimes work on their PhD on Songs of Innocence or Songs of Experience or the eliminated, the prophetic books. But I tried to, in my PhD, to present the kaleidoscopic Blake from different perspectives, even the transtextual indicators and the paratexts in Blake's text. I tried to highlight the previous ideas about Blake, but bring about new ideas. Even in the Songs of Experience, I wrote about the because all the people think about this, speak about the symmetry in Blake's works. I found some asymmetries in some of his works and tried to highlight them, my own perspective. And I was wondering, what if this was not right? What if? But I dared a few ideas. And again, I'm happy to have attended this conference. Yesterday, I texted my friend and told her, this is a community where I want to belong. Really, all Blakean scholars and people speaking about Blake, this is for me, this is wonderful. Thank you for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and then Valentin.
Thank you, Ines. Those are beautiful remarks, and I'm so glad that you've found another community to belong to, of Blake scholars, and you're sharing that with your students and friends. So that's wonderful to hear. And Jason, I think your point about the mental handshake that you have with somebody who's read a single poem, perhaps, of Blake, is very moving, and again, very beautifully put, and I agree with you. But I do want to say one thing about kitsch, and about, because you said, the kitsch isn't so bad. Now I know you're being generous here, and you collect these things, and why not? What we collect is a product of our desire, and who can gainsay it? You can't gainsay somebody's sexual desires anymore. They're collecting habits. But about kitsch and about Blake, the thing is that there is this leveling that kitsch does. And the thing about Blake and other great artists, poets, etc. from the past, is that they reveal a completely different way of understanding the world. And so whenever we try to place Blake in the 20th century, in the 21st century, in the now, through these intermediate objects of kitsch or something, we flatten that history. And therefore we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to think about how our own world could be utterly different than what it is now, because there was a different way of thinking back then. And Blake offered such a vastly different way of understanding than the one that we have access to now. That's what I find so valuable about Blake. So that's why I'm a little more critical about kitsch, although I should have a better sense of humor about it, like you do.
I was also riling your bits in my book.
Yes. I
wrote a long piece about kitsch in the book I did with Roger Whitson, because actually there's a load of stuff. Sorry, Valentin, I'll shut up in a moment. There's a load of stuff that Jerusalem, actually, there's so much kitsch, and actually some of it is incredibly damaging. My flippant comments, there's some kitsch which is there's kitsch that's pure commodity, and and junk, actually, and then there's stuff that's kind of, I collect the mugs, I collect the bits, the paraphernalia. I find it fascinating that somebody wants to own a piece of Blake, but has no idea to own it. And in one sense, it's rather sad that that's what we reduce Blake to, when in the end, all you need to do is look at his pictures or read his poetry.
Thank you.
Valentine had her hand raised.
I did, yes, thank you. It's been absolutely brilliant, eye-opening, inspiring, and really quite scary, the breadth of Blakean scholarship that's out there. I'm very new to Blake and very new to conferences. I'm a postgraduate, not a student yet. I'm hoping to do my MA. But my area of expertise is the 1890s. And I came through to Blake through rewriting Tiger Tiger for a poetry module. But I'm absolutely fascinated by him. And I wondered how, other than reading as broadly as possible, how quickly, or what's a very good publication maybe to access the 18th century that Blake, you know, lived in. I'm particularly curious as to whether he would have had access to French mythology, that kind of thing. Just wondered if anybody out there could give me any advice. I will email.
Michael Phillips is a good person who has a breadth of 18th century understanding, and Blake, obviously. You might think about that.
Yeah, I've just seen Bentley's come in the chat as well, which is always a good. Blake Records is a good place to start, which is just gone in the chat. I think it's a useful one.
And as far as like biographies are concerned, I've got obviously reading Peter Ackroyd, but is it Gilchrist? Did he?
Gilchrist was. He did. It was. It's definitely worth reading. It was the biography really that brought him to more mainstream attention in England. He was kept alive, kind of by his memory was kept alive by people who liked him. But Gilchrist's biography, while an interesting one to read, is a very particular kind of mid-19th century biography. So you're also reading a kind of historical source, which does make it valuable, but might it's probably just good to be aware of that when you're reading it.
Exactly. Read Whittaker. There you go.
Read Whittaker. Yeah, absolutely. Then I know who to direct more questions
I wrote
to.
a book. That book. Thank you. It's intended as a primer. It is intended. It's written for a general audience. I try to cover as many of Blake's work, both the visual as well, because that's one of the things that, with a lot of biographies, I concentrate on Blake's poetry with a little bit of art thrown in. And I actually, for the first time in my life, I found a publisher who was willing to do a book with lots and lots of illustrations. So
that sounds good.
I tried to. So I tried to put it in historical context. I tried to do justice to Blake's life, but actually it's really a primer for the work. And I try to go through as much as possible. It ends up, there's only a couple of pages on each work, where I try to cover the breadth of all of Blake's literary works.
And again, the question about French mythology, would he have 17th century French mythology, would he have had access? He
worked, sorry, send an email and I'll have to, because my PhD was actually on Blake's use of mythology and antiquarianism. I can bore. So the one that I did, William Blake and Myths of Britain, but he used huge numbers of antiquarian mythographers, I call them. So write to me. I will.
Thank you.
Send you a list of recommendations.
Very much. Thank you all very much. It's been brilliant.
Thank you. Rumjana is next, and then I'll have a question with which I want to reconnect that Stephen said earlier about what the difference might be that Blake had visions or didn't have visions. But Rumjana, are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a very specific question in the context of Blake and science to Mark Lucier and maybe Luke Walker. Mark mentioned this, if he can dwell more on it, like the four zoas were used as a mechanism for mental health and the changes that are occurring in human brain when they listen to Blake's poetry being read. Is it really something that was established and had this practical application with the patients that they had was it in Mayo Clinic? Or is it something more still in the theoretical stages? And I think Luke Walker mentioned about the chemical effect on the brain when again Blake's poetry is being read. Can you say something more about this? It was just a passing, but I was curious if you have more to say on this.
So Luke, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, that was certainly something that Allen Ginsberg became very interested in as he, and this relates to the question that Stephen Eisenman asked as well in my panel about does it matter if Ginsberg's own Blake experience may not have happened at all in the way that he later seemed to remember. I mean, he very open-mindedly through his life at different times came up with all sorts of different stories, but also different explanations for what might have caused this strange experience, which may or may not have involved hearing Blake speaking to him, but was certainly an unusual experience, which many people have at different points in their lives. And he it had some relationship to reading Blake in some way. I think we can say that. And he speculated on lots of occasions, especially from the sort of mid to late 60s onwards, that the breathing pattern of reading a text, and obviously this was after his 18 months or so that he spent in India in the early 60s, where he'd become very interested in breathing and meditation, that the breathing pattern through reading different poems may somehow affect one's mental state, and that was Ginsberg's. This was not on a sort of scientific basis that he was, doing any scientific studies on that, but that was a speculation that he certainly attached some value to, yeah, and it makes on a broad sense, in a broader sense, it clearly makes sense, doesn't it? But whether it would be likely to lead you to a sort of full visionary experience is another question.